The morning sunlight touched the runway like a golden ribbon as the private jet stood waiting, its silver body gleaming against the bright sky. Inside the airport lounge, a woman in her early 40s sat quietly by the window, her phone in hand, her mind far away. Her name was Ava Sinclair, one of the most powerful businesswomen on the continent, known for her calm presence and unshakable confidence. To the world, she was the symbol of success, an entrepreneur who built her empire from the ground up. But that morning, something about her looked different. Her eyes were softer, almost tired, as if carrying the weight of years that money could never erase. Ava was traveling from Johannesburg to London for a conference that would announce her company's next big move, an expansion that could redefine technology across Africa. Reporters were already waiting in London to cover her arrival, but Ava didn't care about headlines that day. Her thoughts were on her late father, a man whose life's work had always been surrounded by mystery. She often wondered what secrets he might have taken to his grave. As she approached the jet, the crew greeted her politely. The pilot stood by the stairs, his uniform crisp, his face calm but unreadable. He introduced himself simply as Captain Reed. There was something quiet about him, something that didn't quite fit with the usual warmth of private flight pilots. Still, Ava brushed it off. She was used to meeting people who acted differently around her. Once inside, she settled into her seat near the window. The cabin was spotless, lined with soft leather and muted lights. A flight attendant offered her tea, and she smiled, thanking her gently. It was the small things that still mattered to her, the human gestures that reminded her of who she was before the fame and fortune. The engines began to hum, a sound that usually comforted her. Flying had always been her favorite place to think. The sky made her feel small but free, far away from the noise of business and the constant demands of success. As the jet rose into the clouds, she looked down at the shrinking city below and closed her eyes for a moment, breathing deeply. An hour into the flight, Ava opened her laptop to review her presentation slides. Everything was in order, yet something about the day felt off. The air in the cabin seemed heavier than usual. Captain Reed's voice came through the speaker, calm but distant. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be cruising at 35,000 feet. Please sit back and enjoy the flight." Ava noticed his tone lacked warmth. There was a pause at the end of his announcement, just long enough to make her look up. The flight attendant passed by, adjusting a seatbelt, and Ava smiled faintly, trying to ignore the unease growing inside her. She turned her attention to the window. The sky was endless blue, peaceful and clean. But peace can sometimes hide what's waiting underneath. A sudden flicker of the cabin lights caught her attention. It was brief, but it made her glance toward the cockpit door. The pilot had locked it as usual, but something about how firmly it was shut made her uneasy. She tried to push the thought away, but then she heard a faint beeping sound, followed by the quiet murmur of a radio. Only it didn't sound like normal communication with air traffic control. Ava frowned. She pressed the intercom button beside her seat. "Captain, is everything all right?" she asked. There was a pause, then his voice came through, steady but strange. "Everything's fine, ma'am. Just a small systems check." His answer was polite, but something in the way he said it made her chest tighten. She glanced at the flight attendant, who gave a reassuring smile but looked nervous. That was enough to confirm Ava's instinct. Something wasn't fine. She tried to stay calm. Years of leading a billion-dollar company had taught her that panic never helped. Still, her pulse quickened as she noticed the jet begin to tilt slightly. It wasn't rough turbulence, it was deliberate. The flight attendant went to the cockpit door and knocked softly. "Captain, are we changing route?" she asked. There was no reply. The attendant turned back, her face pale. Ava unbuckled her seatbelt and stood. "Open that door," she said firmly. "I can't, ma'am." "It's locked," the attendant whispered. Ava's voice remained calm, but her heart was pounding. "Then call air control. Tell them we've lost cockpit communication." The woman hurried to the back of the plane, grabbing the emergency radio, but before she could speak into it, static filled the cabin speakers. Captain Reed's voice returned, this time colder. "Please remain seated. Everything is under control." Ava froze. The words didn't sound like reassurance, they sounded like warning. She looked around the cabin. The assistant was trembling now. Ava walked slowly to the cockpit door and knocked firmly. "Captain Reed, I need to know what's happening. We've changed direction." No reply. "Captain," she said again, louder. Finally, his voice came through, softer but tense. We're taking a different route. You'll understand soon. A chill ran through her. A different route? What are you talking about? Turn this plane around! Sit down, Miss Sinclair, he said quietly. You don't understand yet. Ava stepped back, her hands shaking. She could feel fear creeping into her chest, but she forced herself to think. If something had gone wrong, if he was sick, angry, or under threat, she needed to stay in control. She had been in dangerous situations before, but nothing like this. She turned to the attendant. Is there another way into the cockpit? No, ma'am. It's reinforced. Only the pilot can open it. Ava sat down, trying to process what was happening. She reached for her phone, no signal. Of course, they were far from any cell tower. She tried the onboard satellite phone, but it was dead too. Someone had disconnected it. Her breathing quickened and she gripped the armrest. Why would he do this? She whispered. The attendant shook her head, tears forming in her eyes. I don't know, ma'am. He seemed normal before takeoff. Ava looked out the window again. The ground below was no longer green and full of city lights. It was wide, dry, and empty. The desert. They were heading west. Her company's flight plan had been set for London. This wasn't a detour, it was a completely different route. Dear God, she murmured. For the next 30 minutes, silence filled the cabin except for the hum of the engines. Ava's mind raced through possibilities. Could someone have hacked the plane? Was the pilot being forced? Was this political, personal, or something else entirely? Finally, she decided she couldn't just sit there. She walked back to the cockpit and slammed her hand against the door. Captain Reed, if you don't open this door right now, I'll make sure the authorities know this was deliberate. There was a long silence. Then his voice came through, calm but heavy. I'm not hurting anyone, Mrs. Sinclair. You just need to listen. Listen to what? She snapped. You're endangering everyone on this flight, he sighed. You built your empire on things you don't understand. You've spent your life above the clouds, but you've never looked down to see what's been lost beneath them. Ava froze. The words didn't sound like the ramblings of a madman. They sounded like someone who had planned this. What do you want? She asked quietly. I want you to see the truth, he said. Ava backed away, her throat dry. What truth? You'll know soon. The radio went silent again. For a few moments, she just stood there stunned. None of it made sense. She had no enemies that she knew of, at least not anyone capable of this. But the way he spoke, the certainty in his tone, made her realize this wasn't random. It was personal. The jet started to descend slightly. Ava's stomach turned as the horizon shifted. The desert grew larger below them, stretching endlessly. She turned toward the window again, her reflection trembling against the glass. For the first time in years, she felt powerless. She remembered something her father used to say when she was a little girl. The higher you fly, the clearer the world looks. But you can't see the people who helped you rise if you never look down. The words came back to her now, heavy with meaning. Another hour passed and still no communication with the outside world. The flight attendant had stopped trying. She sat across from Ava, tears streaking her cheeks. Ava wanted to comfort her, but she couldn't even comfort herself. Every sound from the cockpit made her flinch. Finally, Ava took a deep breath and stood again. He wants me to see something, she said softly. Then I'll see it. She opened the small compartment where safety tools were stored and pulled out a metal wrench, just enough weight to make a noise if she needed it. She wasn't planning to fight, only to make herself heard. She hit the door hard once, twice. Captain Reed, she shouted. You said you don't want to hurt anyone, then prove it. Tell me what this is about. The engines roared louder for a moment, then steadied. The pilot's voice came again, lower this time. You'll understand when we land. Her eyes widened. Land where? You can't just... But before she could finish, she heard something that made her freeze. The sound of a second voice over the radio. A man's voice. Muffled but urgent. Reed, are you sure about this? Her blood ran cold. There was someone else involved. Ava stumbled backward, her mind spinning. This was no accident. No random act. It was planned. She didn't know by who or why, but it was meant for her. She sat down slowly, her body trembling, her breath shallow. The jet flew deeper into the clouds, leaving behind everything she thought she knew about control, safety, and power. For the first time in years, Ava Sinclair wasn't the one giving orders. She was the one waiting to understand them. And somewhere behind that locked cockpit door, a truth was waiting that would change everything. The jet continued its silent journey over the endless desert, the hum of the engines now feeling more like a warning than a comfort. Inside the cabin, Ava sat completely still, staring out of the window, her reflection pale against the golden clouds. She could see nothing but sand below, miles and miles of nothingness. She had always been a woman who liked control, in business, in life, in everything. But at that moment she had none. The pilot had gone completely quiet. The air felt heavy, and every minute felt longer than the last. The flight attendant sat across from her, holding a small bottle of water but not drinking. Her hands were shaking. Ava reached out gently. "It's okay. Just breathe," she said softly, even though she didn't believe her own words. The young woman nodded, tears sitting on the edge of her eyes. "Why is he doing this?" she whispered. "I don't know," Ava replied quietly, "but he said I'll understand soon. That means there's a reason, and I intend to find out what it is." Her voice was calm, but her heart was racing. She tried the satellite phone again, still dead. Every system that could connect them to the outside world was disconnected. Whoever the pilot was, he had planned this carefully. Ava leaned back in her seat, closed her eyes for a moment, and tried to think clearly. She started to remember details about him. His introduction was brief, polite, professional, but distant. His eyes, though, had looked familiar. Maybe she had seen him before. Maybe at one of her company's flight service trainings or a corporate event. Her memory couldn't place him, but there was something in his face she couldn't shake. Her mind went back to her father again, the man who had built their family's first company. He had been a complicated man, secretive and proud. When he passed away, Ava inherited everything: his companies, his name, and his reputation. Over the years, she had cleaned up much of what he left behind, turning their empire into something modern and respected. But every once in a while, she still received letters, angry ones. People who had lost their jobs or families who had suffered under the industries her father once owned. She had always assumed those letters came from strangers. But what if this man wasn't a stranger? What if this was personal? The plane shifted slightly, dipping lower. Ava could feel it in her stomach. The flight attendant gasped softly. "He's lowering altitude," Ava said, standing up slowly. "We're not heading to London anymore." She walked to the window and looked again. The sun was beginning to set over the horizon, painting the sand in shades of orange and red. It would be dark soon, and they were descending, definitely. Ava walked up to the cockpit door and knocked again, her voice strong this time. "Captain, you said I would understand soon." "Tell me what's going on, please." No response. She knocked again, harder. "If you wanted to hurt me, you could have done that already. So talk to me. What are you trying to prove?" Finally, the speaker clicked. His voice came through, calm but tired. "You'll understand when we land." "We're almost there. Where is there?" she demanded. Silence again. Ava clenched her fists and stepped back. Her mind was spinning. If they were landing somewhere in the desert, someone must be waiting there. This wasn't random. It was too organized. She turned to the attendant.
"Get the emergency bag ready."
"Just in case." The woman nodded quickly and went to the back of the cabin. Ava sat down again, gripping the armrest as the jet descended lower and lower. After what felt like forever, the engine softened. Through the window, Ava saw a flat strip of sand below, like an old airfield. There were small structures in the distance, maybe huts or warehouses. The plane began to slow, wheels touching the ground with a hard thud. Sand rose around them in clouds as the engines whined. When the plane finally stopped, Ava's breath caught in her throat. The desert was silent except for the ticking sound of the cooling engines. The cockpit door opened. Ava stood immediately. The pilot stepped out wearing his cap low over his face. But now she could see his expression, a mix of exhaustion, anger, and sadness. He wasn't holding a weapon, just a small metal case in his hand. "Where are we?" Ava asked quietly. He looked at her for a moment. "Somewhere you've never been. But it's part of your story." Her eyes narrowed. "My story," he nodded. "Get off the plane." "You'll see." The attendant looked terrified, but Ava lifted a hand slightly to calm her. "It's all right. Stay here," she said softly, then turned back to the pilot. "If this is about money, you're wasting your time." He shook his head. "It's not about money." He walked toward the door and lowered the stairs. Warm air rushed in, carrying the scent of sand and heat. Ava hesitated for a second, then followed him out. The ground beneath her shoes felt uneven. The sunset painted the desert gold, stretching shadows far into the distance. She could see old buildings nearby, the kind that looked abandoned long ago. The pilot led her silently toward them. "Why are we here?" she asked again. He stopped and turned to her. "Because this is where everything started. For me, for you, for your father's empire." She frowned. "I don't understand." He opened the metal case and pulled out a stack of faded photographs. "You see these?" he said, handing them to her. Ava took them carefully. The photos were old, worn at the edges. In the first one, she saw a small village, houses made of clay, children playing near a well. In the next, smoke covered the same place. The ground was black, buildings broken. Her heart sank. "What is this?" He looked at her directly. "This was my home," she blinked. "Your home?" He nodded. "It was destroyed 28 years ago by a weapons test run by your father's company. Hundreds died. My mother was one of them." Ava stepped back, her throat dry. That can't be true." "My father," he interrupted softly but firmly. "I've seen the documents, the contracts, the sign-offs. It was part of a defense project your family funded. They covered it up. The world never knew. You grew up in luxury while I grew up in the ashes of that test." Ava's hands shook as she looked at the photos again. "The destruction was horrible and unreal. I didn't know," she whispered. "I swear I didn't know." "I believe you," he said quietly. "That's why I didn't plan to hurt you. I just needed you to see it, to understand what your wealth came from." Tears stung her eyes. She looked out over the desert, trying to imagine it as the place in the pictures, full of life before it was gone. She took a slow breath. "Why not just tell me? Why go through all this?" He looked away for a moment. "Because people like you don't listen when they're comfortable. You only listen when you lose control. You had to feel powerless just once to understand what your company did to the powerless." Ava stood in silence, her chest heavy. She had built her business on clean technology, green energy, innovation, trying to make up for the mistakes of the past. But she had never known this story. Her father's name had opened doors for her, and now it felt like it had been built on tragedy. The wind blew sand across their feet. The pilot looked back at the plane, then at her. "I know what I did was wrong. I took control of your flight without permission. But I couldn't live another day watching people like me disappear while the world praises people like you." Ava met his eyes. For the first time, she saw not anger but pain, deep, lifelong pain. "What do you want from me?" she asked softly. "Nothing," he said. "Just for you to know the truth. That's all." Ava looked down at the photographs again, her vision blurring from tears. The setting sun turned the sky a deep orange. She felt smaller than she ever had in her life. Finally, she spoke. "You're right. I didn't listen before, but I'm listening now." He nodded slightly. "That's all I needed." For a long moment, they both stood in silence, the desert wind blowing between them. Then Ava asked, "So what happens now?" He looked back toward the horizon. "The authorities will come soon. You'll tell them I hijacked the plane and I'll take responsibility. That's what will happen," she frowned. "You think I'd do that? After what you showed me?" He turned back to her. "You have to. I broke the law. It's the only way this ends." Ava shook her head slowly. "Maybe, but it's not the only way the story ends." The pilot said nothing, just looked at her as the last bit of sunlight disappeared behind the dunes. The air grew cooler. The truth between them hung heavy, one built on grief, the other on guilt. When they returned to the jet, Ava looked back once more at the darkening land, trying to imagine the laughter that once filled it. Something inside her shifted, not out of fear but responsibility. As the engines started again and the plane rose into the night sky, she sat by the window in silence. The world below looked endless, but for the first time, she didn't see it as something to conquer. She saw it as something she owed. She didn't know what she would say to the world when they landed or how she would explain what had happened. But she knew one thing. The truth she had learned that day would never leave her, and somewhere deep inside, a small voice whispered that this was only the beginning. The jet cut through the dark sky like a quiet shadow. Inside the cabin, the silence was thick enough to feel. Ava sat near the window, her eyes unfocused, watching the distant stars. The photograph still lay in her lap, edges curling slightly from the dry air. She had looked at them again and again, almost hoping they would change, but the truth remained the same. Her father's company had destroyed that man's village, and though she hadn't known, The guilt weighed on her shoulders like a mountain. Across the cabin, the pilot sat quietly, his face turned away. The flight attendant had finally fallen asleep in one of the rear seats, her head resting against the wall, exhaustion pulling her into uneasy dreams. Ava wanted to say something to him, to the man who had taken control of her flight and, in doing so, shattered her peace. But words didn't come easily. Every sentence she formed in her mind felt too small for what hung between them. After several long minutes, she spoke. "You said the world never knew about what happened to your home." He didn't turn around. "That's right. So how did you find out who was responsible?" He was silent for a while, then said quietly, "I joined the Air Force when I was young. I wanted to understand power, how it worked, how people used it. I thought maybe if I became part of it, I could protect others from what happened to me. But power changes people. When I started flying for private companies, I came across a name on an old list, your father's. It led me to reports, documents, and finally, the proof I showed you." Ava nodded slowly. "And when you saw my name, you decided to confront me." "I didn't plan this at first," he said. "I just wanted to meet you. But every time I tried to reach out, your office blocked it. Your assistant said you were too busy, too important. So I realized I needed to make you listen another way." Ava sighed softly. "You're right about one thing. I've spent so much time being unreachable, I forgot what it feels like to really listen." He finally turned to face her. His expression had softened since earlier, but his eyes still carried years of loss. "You don't have to feel sorry for me," he said. "I just wanted you to see that money can build more than towers, and it can build silence too." Those words sat heavy in her chest. She had built her life on progress, innovation, success, but she had never asked what that success was standing on. Ava stood and walked to the front of the cabin near the cockpit door. "Where are we going now?" she asked. He adjusted a few switches. "We're heading toward a safe airfield. It's small, but we can refuel and call for clearance back to London." She nodded. "And after that?" He hesitated. "After that, I'll tell the authorities what I did. You'll be free to go." Ava looked at him quietly for a moment. "You really think I'll let you go to prison for this?" He gave a faint smile. "I don't expect your forgiveness. I just want you to move forward differently than before." "That's enough for me." She didn't respond right away. The engines hummed beneath them, steady but low. For a long time, there was only the sound of air rushing past the wings. Then suddenly, a loud beep filled the cockpit. The pilot's calm face changed instantly. He leaned forward, checking the radar screen. "What's wrong?" Ava asked, stepping closer. "Sandstorm," he said. "A bad one. It's coming from the north, fast. Can't you fly over it? Too high and we'll lose pressure. Too low, and visibility drops to nothing." The wind outside began to howl. The plane shook slightly and the seatbelt signs lit up automatically. The flight attendant woke with a start, eyes wide with fear. "What's happening?" she asked. "Storm," Ava said, trying to sound calm. "Just sit tight." The pilot's voice grew more focused. "We're going to try to move south, but the signal's weak. I need to find clear air." The plane rocked again, harder this time. Loose items slid across the table. Ava grabbed the armrest and took a deep breath. Through the window, she could see lightning flashing inside the thick wall of sand ahead. The sky had turned a dark, dirty red. Minutes felt like hours as the storm swallowed them. Visibility dropped to almost nothing. The engines roared, straining against the force of the wind. Ava felt her body being pressed against the seat as the jet tilted. "Hold on," the pilot shouted. The jet dropped suddenly and a scream escaped from the attendant. Ava gripped the armrest tighter, her heart racing. For the first time, she realized she might not make it out alive. "Can't we turn back?" she yelled over the noise. "Too late," he said. "We have to ride it out." Another violent shake hit the plane and one of the cabin lights flickered out. Ava's mind raced. Not about money, not about business, but about the faces of people she loved and the people she had ignored. Then, just as suddenly as it began, the shaking eased. The light returned, flickering weakly. The engine steadied. The storm passed. Ava exhaled shakily, her fingers still digging into the armrest. She looked at the pilot, who was breathing hard but steadying himself again. "Are we all right?" she asked. He nodded. "We're through the worst of it. But we've lost navigation." "The system scrambled. So you don't know where we are?" He shook his head. "Not exactly." For a moment, no one spoke. The night outside was endless, like no city lights, no landmarks. Just darkness. Ava looked down at the photos again, then out the window. Maybe this is how it feels, she said softly. To live with no direction. To lose everything. The pilot didn't answer, but his face softened. After a while, he said quietly, You don't have to carry my pain, Ava. Just do something with it. She looked at him. What do you mean? When you go back, don't just make speeches or write checks. Change what's broken. The people who still live in places like mine, they deserve better than silence. Ava nodded slowly. I will. He looked away again, focusing on the flight instruments. We'll land soon. There's an emergency strip about 40 miles from here if we can reach it. Do you think it's safe? Safer than staying in the air. The next hour passed quietly. The flight attendant stayed buckled, whispering prayers under her breath. Ava watched the pilot work, steady, patient, professional. Despite everything, she realized he wasn't a cruel man. He was broken, maybe, but not evil. As the plane descended again, faint lights appeared below. A small landing strip, barely visible. The pilot guided the plane carefully, adjusting every control. The landing was rough. The wheels hit the ground with a heavy jolt and sand blew up around the wings, but they made it. The engines powered down and the cabin went silent again. For a long time, none of them spoke. The silence after the chaos felt unreal. Ava finally stood and looked at him. You saved us, she said quietly. He smiled faintly. After almost killing you. Life's strange that way. She looked at him for a moment, then said softly, You didn't almost kill me. You showed me something I needed to see. I don't forgive how you did it, but I understand why. He looked at her, surprised. You're not afraid of me anymore. I was, she admitted. But fear fades when you see the person behind it. You didn't want revenge. You wanted truth. He nodded slowly. Truth costs more than revenge ever will. Outside, the desert night was quiet again. Stars stretched endlessly across the sky. Ava stepped out of the plane, the cool air brushing against her face. The silence of the world around her felt different now, not empty but waiting. She looked up at the stars and thought of her father. Maybe he had believed he was doing what was right, maybe not. But the choices he made had left scars on people he never met. For the first time, she didn't see herself as his shadow. She saw herself as someone who could change what he had left behind. When she turned back, the pilot was standing near the stairs, hands in his pockets. They'll come soon, he said. Rescue authorities and whoever's closest. Ava nodded. Then let them come. But when they do, I'm not going to tell them the full story. He frowned slightly. You don't have to protect me. I'm not, she said. I'm protecting the truth. If I say everything now, they'll make this about one man. But it's bigger than that. This story isn't about you. It's about what needs to change. He looked at her quietly, almost unsure what to say. You risked everything to open my eyes, she continued. The least I can do is make sure what you showed me doesn't die in the sand. He gave a faint, tired smile. Maybe then something good will come out of all this. Ava nodded. It will. The night wind picked up again, whispering softly through the dunes. The sound reminded her of a heartbeat, faint but alive. For the first time since she boarded that plane, Ava felt peace, not because the danger was over, but because something inside her had changed. The world she knew had cracked open, and from its broken edges, something honest was finally beginning to grow. She looked at the pilot once more. When the rescue team comes, I'll say you had a mechanical failure. You won't go to prison, but you'll have to disappear after that. He nodded slowly. Maybe that's for the best. They stood in silence until distant lights appeared on the horizon, rescue vehicles coming closer. Ava turned to him one last time. You said truth costs more than revenge. You were right, but it's worth paying for. He looked at her, the faintest hint of relief crossing his face. Good luck, Ava, she smiled gently. You too. As the rescue lights surrounded them and voices filled the night, Ava felt something new rise inside her. Not fear, not anger, but purpose, whatever came next. She knew her life would never return to what it was before that flight. And somewhere deep inside, a quiet promise formed that she would make sure the pain she had seen would never be buried again. The desert night was calm after the storm of the day before. A soft wind carried grains of sand across the empty land, whispering against the wings of the silent jet. Rescue lights flickered in the distance, growing brighter as they approached. Ava stood beside the plane, her hair blowing gently, her thoughts tangled somewhere between relief and reflection. The pilot stood a few steps away, his face calm but distant. He had said little since they landed, and she hadn't pushed him. Both knew the weight of what had happened couldn't be captured in quick words. When the rescue vehicles finally reached them, a small team of uniformed officers and medics rushed forward. They checked everyone quickly: pulse, hydration, blood pressure. Ava was fine, though they insisted she sit for a moment. The flight attendant clung to a blanket, still shaking but grateful to be alive. One officer approached Ava. "Ms. Sinclair, we're glad you're safe. We received partial distress signals before losing your flight completely. What happened?" Ava hesitated, glancing toward the pilot. He met her eyes briefly, then looked away. "There was a mechanical issue mid-flight," she said carefully. "We lost navigation and communication. The pilot managed to bring us down safely." The officer frowned. "A mechanical issue. Nothing else?" She shook her head. "Nothing else." He nodded slowly, jotting notes on his tablet. "You're lucky, ma'am. That storm could have taken you down completely." Ava smiled faintly. "Yes, we were lucky. They offered to fly her to the nearest city, but she asked for time first. She wanted to look at the desert one more time." The officer agreed and left her with a bottle of water. The pilot walked toward her, hands in his pockets. "You didn't tell them the truth," he said quietly. "I told them the truth that matters," she replied. "You landed the plane safely." "That's true. And I did lose communication." "That's true too." He gave a faint smile. "You could have ended this by exposing me." "I don't want to end it," she said softly. "I want to understand it." He looked at her curiously. "Understand what?" "Everything," she said. "What happened to you? What happened to my father's company? What happened to people who never got to tell their side of the story?" He nodded slowly. "And what will you do with that understanding?" She turned toward the desert, her voice quiet but steady. "Change it." He didn't answer. The silence between them said more than words could. By morning, they were both flown to the capital for debriefing. The story reached the media within hours. Private jet makes emergency desert landing. Billionaire businesswoman safe. Reporters filled the air with speculation, but none knew the truth. Ava said little to anyone. She stayed quiet through the interviews, the formal reports, even the congratulations from officials. Once the formalities ended, she returned to her penthouse in the city. It was strange to walk into a place so polished after days surrounded by nothing but sand and silence. Everything looked too clean, too perfect. She walked to the floor-to-ceiling window and stared at the skyline. The city glowed in golden lights, alive with energy. But behind that beauty, she now saw something else. The invisible cost of every building, every business deal, every contract signed. For the next few days, Ava didn't take meetings. She avoided her phone, ignored her schedule, and instead spent hours going through old boxes her father had left behind. Files, letters, contracts. Most of them were decades old, but she was searching for one thing: proof. Proof of what the pilot had shown her. Late one night, she found it. Hidden between folders was a small brown envelope. Inside was a document stamped "Confidential, Defense Project 14. Her heart raced as she read. There it was, her father's signature, approving a weapons test in a remote desert area. The coordinates matched the place they had landed. She sat back, breath shaking. It was all true. The company had destroyed that village. Her father had known, and no one had ever been held accountable. The next morning, she called a private investigator she trusted, a man who had worked with her family for years. "I need everything you can find about this," she told him. "Every name, every payment, every cover-up. Don't ask why. Just find it." He agreed without question. As the days passed, Ava began to see her father in a different light. She had always admired him, even loved him deeply. But now she realized how much of his success was built on silence. It didn't make her love him less, but it made her determined to break that silence. Meanwhile, the pilot stayed in the capital under quiet supervision. Authorities called him a hero for saving the flight. He never corrected them. When Ava visited him in the hospital for a checkup, he was sitting by the window staring out at the sky. "They think you're a hero," she said softly. He smiled faintly. "That's better than the alternative." "You could tell them what really happened," she said. "I could," he replied. "But I think the truth's safer in your hands." Ava sat beside him. "You trusted me with a story that could destroy my family's name." "Why?" He looked at her, his eyes calm. Because you looked at those photographs longer than anyone else would have. She smiled sadly. That's not enough reason to trust me. He shook his head. It's enough for me. They sat in silence for a while. Finally, Ava spoke. I don't know what happens next. But I promise you this, I'll make it right. Not for my father, but for the people he forgot. He looked down. Making it right won't bring them back. I know, she said quietly. But maybe it can stop it from happening again. When she left the hospital, she felt lighter and heavier at the same time. She had made a promise, and it wasn't one she could break. Over the next few weeks, Ava started to change the way she ran her company. She called emergency meetings with her board. She stopped projects that ignored community welfare. She created new departments focused on rebuilding and repairing damage from past industries. Many of her investors were confused, some even angry, but Ava didn't care. This isn't about profit anymore, she told them firmly. It's about people. Some of them left, taking their shares with them. Others stayed, watching her with a mix of curiosity and respect. The press began to notice. Articles appeared with headlines like, Billionaire's new mission, redemption or rebranding. Ava didn't respond to any of them. She had stopped caring what the world thought. Months later, she returned to the desert. The pilot was gone, released quietly with no charges. No one knew where he went, and she hadn't asked. But she felt his presence there, in the quiet wind and endless sand. She brought a small team of engineers and community workers. Together, they began rebuilding the ruins of what had once been a village. The locals watched her carefully at first, unsure of her motives. But she stayed week after week, helping carry materials, listening to stories, learning names. Slowly, the walls rose again. Children played where the ground had once been burned. Women cooked near small fires that filled the air with the smell of bread and hope. One evening, Ava stood watching the sunset from a hill near the rebuilt homes. The sky glowed orange and pink, just like the day she had first been brought here against her will. But now it felt different. The place that once held guilt now held purpose. A young boy ran up to her, holding a piece of paper. This is for you, he said shyly. She smiled and unfolded it. It was a drawing, a small airplane flying above a field of flowers with a smiling woman inside. That's me? She asked. The boy nodded proudly. You brought the plane back. Ava's eyes filled with tears. Thank you, she whispered, hugging him gently. That night, as the stars covered the sky, Ava sat near the fire, surrounded by laughter and music. For the first time in her life, she felt peace. Not the cold kind that comes from success, but the warm kind that comes from meaning. When she looked up at the stars, she thought of the pilot. She didn't know where he was. Maybe flying again, maybe somewhere quiet, far away from everything. But she hoped he knew that his message had reached her heart. The wind blew softly through the night, carrying voices and the faint hum of life returning to a place that had once been forgotten. Ava whispered into the wind, I kept my promise. And somewhere beyond the horizon, perhaps he heard her. The sun rose slowly over the desert, painting the rebuilt village in golden light. Ava stood on the edge of the small hill where she had watched the sunrise many times before, feeling the warmth on her face and the cool sand beneath her feet. The sounds of daily life drifted up to her. Laughter, the clinking of tools, voices calling across the rebuilt houses. It was a sound she had never imagined hearing here again. She took a deep breath, thinking about the journey that had brought her back to this place. It had started with fear and confusion, a flight gone wrong, a pilot she didn't know taking her somewhere she had never expected. She remembered the photographs, the pilot's quiet words, the way the desert stretched endlessly below them, and the promise she had made. She had kept it. But even as she stood there, she knew that keeping a promise was only the beginning. What came next was harder. She had to ensure that the story she had discovered did not remain hidden. She had to make it a story of change, not just memory. Her assistant approached, carrying a small tablet with news updates. Ava glanced at it and froze. Headlines flashed across the screen. Billionaire reveals shocking past of family empire. Desert landing mystery turns into historic pledge. And community rebuild fund launched following private jet incident. She felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. The world now knew part of the truth, but the details were still hers to share carefully. She tapped on one of the articles. The story had been written with care, focusing on the promise to rebuild communities affected by past industrial projects. But it did not reveal the pilot's identity, nor the full horror of what had happened. Ava smiled faintly. The pilot had trusted her, and she would honor that trust. Some truths were not for the world to judge. Some truths were for people to see, understand, and change their actions from. She turned her attention back to the village. Children were running around the open courtyard playing games with makeshift balls. Women were carrying baskets of freshly baked bread, calling to each other in friendly laughter. Men were repairing fences, painting walls, and helping the younger generation with small tools. Ava walked down the hill, feeling the earth under her shoes, each step grounding her more than the city ever could. A small boy ran up to her, holding out a drawing. Ava knelt down and took it carefully. It was a colorful picture of a plane flying over a field of green, with people waving up at it from below. Her heart ached and lifted at the same time. "You like it?" the boy asked shyly. "It's beautiful," Ava said, her voice soft. "Thank you for showing me." He beamed, and she ruffled his hair gently. "One day you'll tell stories about this place," she said, "and they'll remember how people worked together to bring it back." The pilot had told her once that actions mattered more than words. Ava had lived those words over the past months. Now she understood that the rebuilding of this village was only the beginning. She had to take this message to the rest of the world. She had to show that accountability, compassion, and change could coexist with ambition and success. In the following weeks, Ava returned to the city. Her life shifted in ways no one had expected. Board meetings were no longer just about profit and growth. They were about responsibility. She held conferences not to boast of achievements, but to announce programs to repair communities affected by industrial projects around the world. She spoke to journalists and investors alike, and for the first time, her voice carried a mix of authority and humility that few had heard from her before. At one press event, she stood on a stage overlooking a crowd of reporters. Her heart pounded, but she remembered the desert, the children, the laughter, and the pilot's words. She spoke with clarity and calmness, telling them about initiatives for education, healthcare, and infrastructure in communities that had been ignored for decades. "We cannot undo the past," she said, her eyes scanning the audience. "But we can rebuild the future. We owe it to those who suffered, to those who survived, and to those who will come after us. This is our responsibility." The crowd was quiet at first, then erupted in applause. Ava smiled, but her mind was not on the applause. It was on the village, on the people who had trusted her, and on the promise she had kept. Behind the scenes, she worked with experts and community leaders to ensure that the projects were not just symbolic. Schools were built, clean water systems installed, and small businesses supported. She visited the sites herself, often traveling without the usual entourage, listening to stories, helping when she could, learning more about what had been lost and how it could be restored. Months passed, and her reputation transformed. The world began to see not just the billionaire who had once been distant and untouchable, but a woman deeply committed to change. Yet she remained humble, never claiming credit for what had been done. She only pushed for actions to continue. Then one day, she received a letter without a return address. She opened it carefully. Inside was a simple note. "You kept your promise. Thank you." "A friend?" She smiled, her chest tightening. She didn't need to know the sender's name. She already knew. Somewhere far away, the pilot had seen the impact of his actions ripple through the world. He had trusted her with a burden, and she had carried it with honor. Weeks later, she flew back to the desert. The village had grown even more vibrant, filled with life, hope, and laughter. Children ran across the sand, playing games that made her smile. The adults worked together, teaching, building, sharing. She walked through the streets quietly, feeling the weight of history and the lightness of new beginnings. A group of villagers gathered around her, smiling and waving. One woman approached carrying a small basket of food. "For you," she said, placing it gently in Ava's hands. "Thank you," Ava said softly, her eyes misting. A young girl tugged at her sleeve. "Are you going to stay?" she asked. Ava knelt down to the girl's level. "I'll visit," she said, "and I'll make sure this place stays safe and happy." The girl smiled and ran back to play with the others. Ava stood looking out over the village and felt a deep sense of peace. She realized that this place, which had once been destroyed and silenced, now had a voice. She had helped give it that voice, but the people themselves had reclaimed it. Her phone buzzed. A message from her assistant reminded her of a conference in London. She smiled faintly. Her work was far from over. There were other communities, other stories, other places where she could make a difference. But for now she stayed a little longer in the desert, listening to the wind, the laughter, and the quiet strength of life returning. That night, under a blanket of stars, Ava sat by a small fire. She thought about the journey that had brought her here, the flight, the storm, the pilot, and the photographs that had shown her a truth she could not ignore. She thought about her father, about the lives affected by his decisions, and about the responsibility she had inherited. She whispered into the wind, "I will not forget. I will not fail." Somewhere in the distance, the faint sound of a plane passed overhead. She smiled softly. Whether he was watching or not, she felt a connection, a shared understanding that one small act of courage and honesty could ripple into something greater. The desert was quiet again, but this time it felt alive. It was no longer just a place of destruction or loss. It was a place of rebirth, hope, and endless possibilities. Ava rose, brushing sand from her clothes, and looked toward the horizon. She knew that life would continue to challenge her, that the world would still demand power and decisions. But she had learned something profound. Real power was not in wealth, nor in control, nor in fear. Real power was in understanding, in listening, and in taking responsibility for what had been done, and what could be done better. Ava smiled as the first light of dawn painted the village in warm gold. She would continue her work, guided by truth, compassion, and the lessons of the desert. And somewhere deep inside she felt a quiet joy, the knowledge that a promise kept could change not just one life, but many. The stars faded, the sun rose higher, and the desert breathed a quiet, steady life. Ava Sinclair, once a woman of ambition and distance, now walked among the people she had helped reclaim hope for, fully present, fully aware, and fully committed. The journey had ended, but the story, the true story of responsibility, redemption, and courage, was just beginning.